Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. My name's Ricky Atta. I have the privilege and honor to be the Dean of the Faculty of Land and Food Systems, and I'm delighted to be your host tonight. On behalf of UBC, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone and thank you in advance for helping create a respectful and inclusive environment for your fellow alumni, guests, and speakers. We would like to acknowledge that the UBC Robson Square facility is situated on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I also want to recognize that many places we live, work, and play, and to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. By acknowledging the traditional owners of these lands, we are reminding ourselves that Canada's legacy of colonialization continues into the present, and that all of us have an obligation to advance reconciliation and decolonization in this country. And now, to provide everyone with some background, this evening is an important celebration to mark the 25th anniversary of UBC's Animal Welfare Program. Faculty members give lectures nationally, internationally, and serve as advisors to some of the world's most influential organizations, including the United Nations and the World Organization for Animal Health. I would also like to acknowledge someone who was instrumental in initiating the Animal Welfare Program. Professor Jim Thompson was a strong advocate for bringing this program to UBC. Jim served as the founding director of the Dairy Education and Research Center in Agassiz. He led its tremendous growth over the span of 23 years until his retirement in December 2018. Well, it gives me great pleasure now to introduce our esteemed speaker, and I'm just going to give you a bit of history about David. So David was recruited by UBC in 1996 as the program's first appointment. He arrived with a distinguished career, first at the University of Edinburgh, and then with the Government of Ontario, and then finally at the Central Experimental Farm in Ottawa, which is an Ag Canada facility. I think it was called Ag Canada, just Ag Canada when you started, David, not Agri-Food and Agriculture Canada. While in Ottawa, he created an internationally known team of scientists working on the animal welfare program, including our own Dan Weary, who joined David to start the Animal Welfare Program at UBC. So Dan, thank you for coming along with David. David is also, I'm going to use the present tense, is also one of UBC's most popular teachers. Now, David retired from the university last month after a very distinguished 50-year career. He will speak tonight on 50 years of animal welfare.
Good. Thank you very much, Ricky, for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for the honor of being able to share some thoughts with you tonight. In case you were wondering, the slide shows some of the animals that have helped me in my research over the years in works of art that I have either been given or acquired in some other way. So we can think of them as sort of co-authors of what I'm going to say. And with that in mind, let me start with a poem written from their point of view. And it's in blank verse because pigs especially are very bad at rhyme. Who are these intruders in the forest, walking stiffly on two hind legs to set their vision closer to the clouds? Noisy as jays, clumsy as porcupines, whose scent makes even wolves turn back in fear. Pity any creature so inept, thin and hairless, unable to bear cold, afraid like hearth-bred cats to splash through water. Their nose dwarfed and weak, so high above the ground to read the messages of tracks and markings. their ears flat and shriveled, fixed against their head, oblivious alike to sound and silence. Their feet so large and leaden that the scornful forest floor crackles with contempt beneath their passing. What does such a creature do to hide their many defects? They build a world apart where they may live in comfort and call themselves creation's finest work. Well, I thought we should begin with that note of humility by realizing that we must look like clumsy intruders in the natural world of animals. And I'm going to argue later on that this clumsy intrusion is actually creating animal welfare problems on a huge scale. Well, 50 years ago, I started my first job in Edinburgh with a mandate to begin some research on the welfare of pigs in the intensive confinement husbandry systems that were starting to be used at the time. One of my projects was to do research on the welfare of sows in those controversial stalls that have now been banned in quite a number of countries of the world. Now, we sometimes get a little discouraged by the slow pace of change that happens, but when you use a 50-year time scale starting back then things look very different. So I wanted to share with you 5 of the changes that I have seen over 50 years in the area of animal welfare. But this is also the anniversary of the UBC Animal Welfare Program, which I hope will be with us for decades to come. So I thought we should also look at the next 50 years, and I'm going to raise 3 issues that I think are going to become particularly significant over the next half century. Before getting into that stuff, I need to make a few reflections on the heroic efforts of a few individuals to get the animal welfare program started. The idea for the program goes back to around 1990, when the BC SPCA, with David Wooldridge as president, approached UBC offering to fund a faculty position in animal welfare. The SPCA had already been funding individual projects, but Dr. Wooldridge especially realized how much more could be done with a permanent faculty member. On that basis, Dr. Bob Blair, who is here with us tonight, called me around 1990 to ask if I might consider moving to Vancouver for such a position. I couldn't do that because of family reasons, but I did come to UBC and help with some planning, and my best advice was to expand the funding base because there was a great need for work on agricultural animals, and a person funded solely by the SPCA might lack credibility in farming circles. Several years later, the immensely committed Jim Thompson took the lead on this, just as Finance Minister Paul Martin's cost-cutting led to the closing of the entire institute where I was employed in Ottawa. And Jim phoned to ask whether possibly things might have changed my mind. Now, Jim had really heard the advice about expanding the funding base, and he had now recruited a large group of agricultural organizations as funders, particularly Dairy Farmers of Canada, who for some time became one of our largest agricultural sponsors. Many individuals supported the program, and with the involvement of Dr. Rob Ashburner, who is president of the BC Veterinary Medical Association, a huge number of BC veterinarians became donors. The UBC Centre for Applied Ethics, with Michael MacDonald as director, who is here with us tonight, also supported the program and provided very valuable cooperation and worked closely with us. And the national funding body, National Funding Council that funds biological research, gave matching funds for all this because the work we were planning to do would have application within the Canadian economy. The result was a funding package that allowed the hiring of Dan Weary as well as myself, Then a few years later, the Faculty of Land and Food Systems, with Maura Quayle as dean, hired Marina von Kaiserlink, and more recently, with Ricky as dean, funding from the BCSPCA, the Granting Council, and the faculty allowed us to bring Sasha Protopopova as our new specialist in companion animals. So my purpose in saying all this is to say that we would not be here were it not for David Wooldridge and the BCSPCA, Dairy Farmers of Canada, many other agricultural groups, our valued individual donors, including many veterinarians in the province, Michael MacDonald and the Centre for Applied Ethics, the National Council, the continued support from the Faculty of Land and Food Systems, and most especially the involvement of Jim Thompson and before him Bob Blair, who championed the creation of the program. So profound thanks to all those who made the program possible. But let's go back to 1971 when I was starting my first job, and the term animal welfare wasn't often heard, and the phrase animal welfare science didn't yet exist in the English language. Of course, there had been traditional concern about the human treatment of animals, at least since the 1700s. But the focus had been principally on acts of cruelty. The British artist William Hogarth was a contributor to this campaign against cruelty to animals, and his contribution was to do 4 pictures called The 4 Stages of Cruelty, which were widely distributed as a kind of visual sermon. Here was his second stage, where we see a callous carriage driver beating a horse who has fallen, trying to pull a carriage overloaded with fat lawyers. Further back, we see someone goading an overburdened donkey. Then way at the back, some people engaging in the old blood sport of bull baiting. Further forward, a drover is clubbing a sheep, which is driving down to a slaughter plant. And to make Hogarth's point that harm to animals goes hand in hand with harm to people, Hogarth included a careless cart driver who's about to run over a child. This focus on acts of cruelty remained the main focus of animal protection for roughly a century and a half. And this is why the early animal protection organizations are not called animal protection organizations, or certainly not animal welfare organizations, but societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals. Then, around 1960, things began to change. Oops. Yes, and a catalyst for this was the publication of this book, Animal Machines, published by Ruth Harrison in 1964, who wanted to introduce the general public to the confinement or intensive production systems that were starting to be used more and more for farm animals. And Mrs. Harrison was emphatic that she was not talking about farmers committing acts of cruelty, and therefore the concerns she was raising were not covered by existing laws against acts of cruelty. Instead, the discussion had to be broadened to the quality of life of animals and how that is affected by the ways that we house and rear them. And the phrase that came to capture this new concern was animal welfare. According to one historian, the phrase animal welfare was rarely heard in 1960, and by 1970, it was emerging as a dominant theme in animal protection. All right, this set the stage for a new field of science, because right from the start, people recognized that if the goal is to safeguard the welfare of animals, science can help us achieve that. How to prevent pain, how to make environments more comfortable, what frustrates animals, and so on. And in Edinburgh, 1971, my job was to start work in this new area. But it was also new that when I tried to explain to people what I was doing, they were often baffled or even thought I was joking. To many people, the only connection between scientific research and animal welfare is the harm done to animals in biomedical research laboratories. So to say that you are doing scientific research on animal welfare just made no sense. Then, 10 years later, Marion Dawkins published this book, Animal Suffering, subtitled The Science of Animal Welfare. And finally we felt, through Marion's bold declaration, that we had an identity for this new field of science. Unfortunately for me as a Canadian, all these developments were happening in Britain and Europe, not in North America. So when my wife and I wanted to return to Canada in the mid-70s, there was no such thing as a position in animal welfare science. So I switched to studying these animals and rejoiced in the title of Provincial Moose Research Biologist for Ontario. It felt like a total change of field, but it was actually a radical re-education in animal welfare. I was surrounded by conservationists who thought of animals in rather abstract terms like population size and biodiversity. But I, with my background, saw animals also as individuals with a quality of life that was being profoundly affected by people. So this, for example, was the moose who we called Lewis, and the fact that he and a number of other recognized individuals came back so regularly every June to this muddy spot deep in a forest, which actually is a slow seeping mineral spring giving out salty water. This made me realize that moose have a seasonal attraction to salt, starting in May, peaking in June, declining in July, and that this also explains why that is the exact pattern of road accidents involving moose in central Canada, because the moose were being attracted to residues of highway de-icing salt. And of course, the experience of winching up bodies of dead moose off roads was a radical education in how human actions are having effects on the welfare of wild animals. Then in 1981, Canadian Ministry of Agriculture, to my surprise, actually created a position in farm animal welfare. And so for the next 17 years, I returned to the farm animals and slowly built a team of scientists working in the area. 12 years later, we were able to recruit a then young Dan Weary to join the group, along with Ed Pager, Jeff Russian, and Anne-Marie Depassier, all three of whom have gone on to brilliant careers elsewhere and have come to join us here tonight. The science, however, grew very slowly. For those of you who like graphs, I won't have many of these. Here's the number of publications per year in animal welfare science, starting, the first arrow is 1971 when I began. The second arrow is 1997 when we began the Animal Welfare Program here at UBC. And you can see the extremely slow growth for many years, well, 25 years really. But now that the field has really caught on and we're seeing a kind of almost exponential growth. And the application of this work is having stunning effects that I'll come to in a few minutes. A third remarkable development has been the growing awareness of animal welfare as an issue of concern. And let me give just one illustration from our own experience here in Vancouver. When Dan and I first arrived at UBC, we said we would start the university's first undergraduate course in animal welfare. And we called it Animal Welfare and the Ethics of Animal Use. And 20 students signed up. And I remember Jim Thompson's great relief when he saw that this new field of science that he had courageously brought to the university actually generated some level of student interest. Next, Marina von Kaiserlink and I started a course called Animals and Society, a kind of overview of how people interact with animals and the issues that arise. And again, 20 students signed up. Nina now has to limit her section of the course to 120. But that means that there's a great deal of extra demand, so we've added 2 other sections to the course taught by our graduate Amelia McRae. Dan and Nina then added a course on research methods in applied biology with strong implications for animal welfare. I added one called Animals and Global Issues. With Ricky's leadership, we were able to hire Kristen Walker as a professor, and she's here with us tonight. And she does 5 courses: stress and coping in animals, applied animal behavior, human-wildlife conflict, compassionate conservation, and a compassionate conservation field course that takes place in Thailand. Then, with a generous donation from a donor who I believe is here with us tonight, Kathy Shupley was able to start a course called The Welfare and Ethics of Animals in Science, and that is now taught by one of our other graduates. Amelia McRae, one of our graduates, has now been appointed as a lecturer in the faculty. She teaches equine biology, health, and welfare, as well as my old courses. Our graduate, Sarah Dubois, has created a practicum course that gives dozens of students every year practical experience as interns in animal shelters, wildlife rehab centers, and elsewhere. Our wonderful new faculty member, Sasha Protopopova, has begun 2 courses: experimental analysis of animal behavior, animal sheltering, and companion animal support. And our graduate, Alex Boo, teaches a course called Health, Welfare, and Diseases of Shelter Animals. Okay, my point is that starting 25 years ago with 1 course and 20 students, we now have 15 courses, 8 instructors, and many hundreds of students involved in our undergrad program. I point this out just as an illustration of the increase that we have seen in public interest in animal welfare across the board, in farming, zoos, shelters, laboratories, initially in the European and English-speaking world, and now spreading very widely around the world, so that in 50 years, animal welfare has gone from being an unfamiliar phrase to now being a social concern that is almost universally recognized. With those changes in awareness, we also saw a huge expansion of leadership on these issues. When the early anti-cruelty laws were passed, the police generally showed very little interest in enforcing them. Instead, enforcement was largely left to citizen groups who formed societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals, and they took over the most of the enforcement. And so here was an area where government was willing to pass laws, but it was really all of the leadership was left to charitable organizations. That persisted for something like a century and a half. By the 1970s, as public concerns grew, governments felt the need to show more leadership, and one of the first things they did was to facilitate or lead the creation of codes of practice for the welfare of farm animals. By the 1980s, governments were becoming more engaged. For example, 1981, Switzerland banned the battery cage for hens. 1988, Sweden passed a law saying that dairy cows must have access to pasture in the summer. And in 1999, the UK banned those sow stalls exactly 25 years after I had done those first experiments showing the welfare effects of that kind of housing. By the 1990s, the corporate world became involved. I remember my surprise and, skepticism on getting a call from the Burger King Corporation saying they wanted to create animal welfare standards for their suppliers, and would I come and help? Now, I have never been a big fan of fast food restaurants, and I have tended to be a Canadian who prides himself in not repairing to places like Florida in the winter. And so I had to suffer some loss of self-esteem when I said that I was going to Miami to meet with Burger King. It was actually a very good experience. One of the colleagues that I worked closely with on those committees was the well-known Temple Grandin, who has vast experience at slaughter plants. And Temple was able to document how within 1 year, huge improvements were made in animal welfare at slaughter plants in the year that followed the chain restaurants requiring their suppliers to meet certain standards. Then in the 2000s, major international agencies also became involved. The World Organization for Animal Health was created in Paris about 1 century ago, mostly to prevent the international spread of animal diseases. In 2001, the roughly 170 member countries voted to begin developing global standards of animal welfare. They assembled this motley crew as a committee to guide the process, anachronistically male by today's standards. But the result was that the Terrestrial Animal Health Code, which is known around the world, now has 100 pages of animal welfare standards, and in many countries, these are the only animal welfare standards that the country has. I also worked with this organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which wanted to promote animal welfare as part of its programs of agricultural development. So it convened an international committee that produced this book, Capacity Building to Implement Good Animal Welfare Practices. And among other things, the document emphasized how central animal welfare is to the prosperity of smallholder farmers, landless livestock owners, cart drivers, and others. Here's the group that wrote that report, assembled on the balcony of the apartment that we rented in Rome for the occasion. And I want to particularly thank my wife, Nancy, who's here, who organized receptions for these highly international groups, coming together for just a few days and having to engage in a complex task and come out with a product at the end of, say, a week's time. And you can't overstate how much that process is facilitated by having a social reception where the people can get to know each other personally. Also to thank Hélène and Michael Redding. Hélène, who may be here tonight, is on the right. Michael was probably taking the picture. There, wonderful. Michael was probably taking the picture, and they came with us on a couple of occasions and very kindly helped us host those receptions. Right, my point here is that what we have seen, in addition to the public awareness, is a huge expansion in leadership on animal welfare issues, starting really with charitable organizations, then governments, then major corporations becoming involved, then major international agencies becoming involved, and each level providing different and somewhat complementary kinds of leadership. But none of that would have happened without the growing application of animal welfare science. So the committees for the chain restaurants were made up principally of scientists studying animal welfare. Organizations like the World Organization for Animal Health won't pass standards unless there's science behind them. So just to give a glimpse of how the science influences standards and this whole process, a few examples. So here's Cassandra Tucker, who is with us here tonight, now a professor at University of California. When Cassandra was here doing her PhD, dairy farmers frequently were cutting the tails off their dairy cows because of the widespread belief that an intact swishing tail makes the cow dirtier and affects the health of the udder. Cassandra did the first actual experiment showing that this is quite untrue. It was then replicated elsewhere, and dairy farmers of Canada, to its immense credit, recommended that the practice should cease across the country. And I think today the tail docking of dairy cows would be either rare to non-existent in Canada as a result. Lee Neal is now a professor at University of Guelph. Joanna Makowska is a staff member with the Animal Welfare Institute in Washington. When they were here doing their graduate work, laboratory rats were typically killed at the end of experiments by being exposed to lethal levels of carbon dioxide. Lee showed that this is not a humane practice because the rats find the carbon dioxide distressing at levels well below what would cause them to become unconscious. And Joanna then showed that if you instead use the gas isoflurane, many rats will simply lose consciousness without showing any signs of distress. And on that basis, the Canadian Council on Animal Care has revised its guidelines on humane euthanasia. Yanni Stoikov, who's with us tonight, is now on staff with the BC Ministry of Agriculture. For his PhD, he worked with these animals, the older dairy cows when they're being removed from the farm and sent for slaughter. And in a heroic effort, Yanni spent a year repeatedly visiting farms and recording roughly 1,000 cows just before they were put on the truck, and then monitoring them when they arrived at the slaughter plant, and to see when they arrived and their condition. Farmers typically expected that the animals would arrive for slaughter within 1 day. Yanni showed that the average cow took more than 3 days. Some took 4, 5, and 6 days, and many showed quite serious deterioration by the time they arrived. It was the first really quantitative data that we had on this problem. And 2 years later, I'm reporting the timing, I'm not claiming cause and effect. 2 years later, the federal government established a new maximum transit time for lame or lactating cows at 12 hours. Sometimes practices are just adopted without the need to put them into standards. Here is Amelia McRae, who's now part of our teaching team. She did her graduate work at the Marine Mammal Rescue Center of the Vancouver Aquarium, and she found that orphaned harbor seal pups, 100 or more of which are brought every year to the center to be rehabilitated and released. They needed far more calories than the diet that was being provided by the center at the time. The year after Amelia's study, the center adopted her improved feeding regime, and the survival rate of the pups increased dramatically. And Nadine Gorkov, before she became a staff member with the BC SPCA, she showed in her master's research that cats in shelters settle down faster and are adopted faster if there's some furniture in the cage that lets them hide when they're frightened and perched on a raised surface. And this led directly then to the hide, perch, and go box that's widely used in shelters around North America. Well, those are just a few examples from our, I think it's 86 MSc and PhD graduates whose research has made huge contributions to our understanding and huge improvements in practice and policy. So just to summarize, 5 developments that I wanted to highlight for the first 50 years. We've seen a shift from this emphasis on cruelty to a much broader concern about the welfare of animals. The emergence of animal welfare science from nothing to a vibrant field. Huge growth in public awareness of the issues, expanding leadership now involving some of the major international agencies of the world, and a growing application of animal welfare science. But what will things look like over the next 50 years? And here I wanted to just highlight 3 areas where I see a need for major change. The first is a growing emphasis on what we might call good lives for animals. When concern over animal welfare first arose in the 60s and 70s, the first priority was negative states like pain, fear, frustration, discomfort that we felt could be present in animals the way we were raising them. So we had to find ways of quantifying, of measuring these kind of states in animals so that we could then find mitigative actions. And this was at a time when it was still being widely taught that doing research on the mental states of animals was beyond the scope of science. I want to just give an early example to illustrate how we approach this. For example, here is a young pig who has got away from its mother and littermates. When this happens, the pig's behavior changes radically, and it becomes agitated and vocal, and it appears that we would say it is feeling separation distress. But how do you quantify separation distress in a pig? Well, under these conditions, pigs have characteristic calls that they make, starting quiet and low, and ending up loud and shrill. Dan Weary has provided me years ago with this sonogram of some characteristic example of the calls. The first two are a lot of energy in very low energy, because these are grunts made with the mouth closed, sounding like Then here are a couple of calls with a bit of higher energy. That's because they're made with the mouth open, sounding like ah, ah. Then we've got calls jumping from that grunt component up to a high-pitched squeal, so that these go aye, aye. So the whole sequence sounds like aye, aye, aye. Now, I knew that you wouldn't want to leave the singing to me, so I wrote this out in musical notation so that we can all join in. All right, I would point out it is to be sung por cabili con spiritu, in a pig-like voice and with spirit. No audition is required for participation, so I hope everyone will join me in singing. Are we ready? Aye, 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 aye. Thank you very much. Well, if when piglets have to be separated from the sow, producers just put them in a pen by themselves, away from the mother and a mixture of other animals, piglets may give those calls for hours or days before they settle down. But here is a simple little experiment showing that if a pig is put alone in an unfamiliar place, we get a lot of those squealy calls. If the littermates and mother are present, almost none. But the presence of 4 littermates are almost as effective as the presence of the mother in reducing that separation distress. So here is a very feasible way to keep piglets less distressed at the time when they have to be taken away from the mother. I collected those data 48 years ago. Fairly typical of the kind of work we were doing then, and continued over many decades of trying to come to grips with these negative states like pain, fear, frustration. Now that so much progress has been made on those states, I think it's time to turn, and people are beginning to turn their attention to positive states like comfort and contentment and enjoyment. But these are actually more challenging to study scientifically. But here are a few little glimpses. All right, here's another sonogram. And since you are now experienced in singing sonograms, could I have a volunteer to sing this for me? Well, you'll notice that it's only going up to 400 hertz, none of that high squealy stuff that we heard from the pig. See, these are quite low. It's a 3-second sequence. It sounds roughly like, oh, ha, 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 ha. Yeah, this is the person laughing. Yeah. And we have now found laughter-like sounds in over 60 species of animals, typically given in situations where the animals are playing, like these two rats. And the calls have many properties in common with human laughter, a rapid, repeated sequence that's fairly quiet and low frequency. Many species also have sounds that look analogous to the purring of cats, given during nursing or huddling together or mutual grooming. And although they can serve different functions, these are thought to indicate comfort and contentment. The hormone oxytocin, we know it because it's the hormone that causes milk release during a nursing episode, but it is also released in smaller amounts during affectionate bonding. So, for example, when this mother and baby hold a mutual gaze, they will both have a release of oxytocin that we think of as being associated with feelings of pleasure. Many other species have an oxytocin release during times of bonding, and dogs, but not hand-raised wolves, have an oxytocin release during mutual gaze with a familiar, friendly person. In fact, one hypothesis is that during domestication, dogs acquired this ability to engage with a mutual gaze with people, and that this helped them become, quote, humankind's best friend. And finally, what we might call non-urgent behavior. When we have some urgent need, such as to drink when dehydrated, or escape when we sense danger, the behavior is motivated by an unpleasant state that's so familiar to us that we have names for them, like thirst and fear. But when we don't have those sort of demands, there are still many things we can do that are not urgent in any way, but may be beneficial in the long term, like playing, which helps children develop motor skills, or exploring, which may help us acquire useful information. And these are largely motivated by the enjoyment that they provide, not by a negative state corresponding to thirst and fear. So for any given species, we can look for the types of behavior that the animals naturally do that are likely to be beneficial in the long term, but not on an urgent basis. So playing and exploring are obvious candidates, but also renewing scent markings, ask any dog. Watching quietly in case things move, ask any cat. Digging, burrowing, hiding food, mutual grooming, self-grooming, and so on. So here's a project for zoos and other places where animals are kept in captivity to identify the ways that animals naturally use unoccupied time and provide opportunities for those types of behavior. Another topic that cries out for more attention is the human dimension of animal welfare. The early animal welfare standards focused very much on the environments where animals were kept. So no cages for hens, more space for pigs, and so on. But when we compare basic welfare outcomes, say on different farms, all using the same physical environment, we always see huge variation in welfare outcomes. For example, Nina von Kaiserlink studied dozens of dairy farms, all using the same type of housing. Some of the farms had virtually no lame cows. In other farms, most of the cows showed some level of lameness. And we see this over and over, and it makes us realize that we are missing an important factor, and I think that important factor is the handling that the animals receive from people. Part of the solution is to provide, to develop professional performance standards for people who work with animals, and the BCSBCA's Animal Kind accreditation program is an important start in that direction. In addition, we need research on what are the elements that need to be present, and here's a start. So skillful handling is obviously a factor. Thanks to the Australian Paul Hemsworth, shown here, and with his book, Human-Livestock Interactions, we know that the skill with which people handle animals, do they approach too quickly? Do they use a quiet voice, and so on, has a huge effect on how comfortable the animals feel in human presence, and this has carry-on effects for things as basic as their health. Here's one of Paul's studies on a large number of dairy farms, where they recorded the amount of negative handling by the staff, the number of slaps, hits, pushes, and tail twists, which correlated positively with the cows avoiding a handler, positively with the amount of the stress-related hormone cortisol present in the milk, and correlated negatively with the yearly milk yield on the farm. The attitude of people working in animal care is also very important. Another of Paul's studies, they interviewed farm workers for how they saw cows, and those who described them in positive terms, like stimulating, entertaining, and intelligent, used better handling and got better welfare outcomes than those who described them in negative terms, like noisy, smelly, and ugly. So selecting staff who have a positive attitude toward animals, or training staff in a way that improves attitude toward animals, is an important step. Consistency is important. Here's a clouded leopard, commonly kept in zoos, where they often show serious signs of stress. A study compared stress levels in clouded leopards in different zoos that had different philosophies about animal handling. The number of keepers looking after a clouded leopard varied from zoo to zoo, from 2 to 7, and there were lower stress responses with fewer keepers, the same 2 or 3 people, not a rotating cast of 6 or 7. The zoos also differed greatly in how many contact hours there were between the staff and the cats, because in some cases they thought these are wild animals, we should minimize our level of contact. In other cases they took the opposite view. And the answer seems to be there's lower stress levels with very high contact time. So here we see the effect of consistency and predictability for the animals dealing with the same individuals having lots of exposure to the animals. Another factor that's emerging, not yet studied nearly enough, is job satisfaction. Here was a study of 900 farmers in Norway who rated their level of agreement with statements like, I am satisfied with my working day, I can live well with my income, and I feel appreciated as a farmer. And those were combined into an index called occupational well-being. They also scored their level of agreement with statements like, I often feel stressed due to work, I often feel tired, I often feel lonely as a farmer. And they combined those into an index of occupational stress. And then with a very complex indicator of the different elements of welfare outcomes combined into an animal welfare index, they found those were positively related to occupational well-being and negatively related with occupational stress. So having a work environment that people like to be in, having enough staff so that people don't feel overwhelmed in the care they're providing for animals. These are actually ways to improve animal welfare. And as a related point, of course, the health and mental health of animal caregivers is critically important. 2 recent studies looked at cases of neglect of animals, and in most cases, these were related to problems of physical and mental health in the caregivers. And of course, as we now know, animal hoarding, major animal welfare problem. This is now recognized by psychiatrists as a distinct form of mental illness. And here again, if we don't deal with the health and mental health of the person, we will never solve the animal welfare problem. So just to summarize a few of the elements that are emerging in this early work on the human dimension of animal welfare: the importance of skillful handling, of positive attitudes, consistency, job satisfaction, and of course, human and the health and mental health of the people. And I believe this is just a start at understanding the human determinants of animal welfare. I want to end with a new challenge, and possibly the most urgent of all for animal welfare in the current century. And I thought we should do this with a story and a quiz question. Here's the story. In 1957, in the early days of commercial television, a very tall television transmission tower was put up in a small community in Wisconsin. And later that year, one evening in August, a local resident reported that it appeared to be raining birds. And in the morning, several hundred dead birds were collected from her roof and her garden and the surrounding properties. Fortunately, this attracted the attention of Dr. Charles Kemper, who is a local resident and a wildlife rehabilitator, and he decided to keep an eye on this tower. And in an astonishing display of dedication, he and a helper visited the tower every morning, helping those birds that were injured, recording the deaths that occurred, and they did this for 38 years. It was the best data set we have on this problem, and Kemper concluded, correctly, as we now understand, that this is principally a problem during spring and fall migration, that it's happening to night-flying migrants, and many, many species of birds do their migratory flights at night, and it was happening on overcast nights because the lights on the tower appeared to disorient many of the birds, who then flew around until they collided with one of the many, many cables supporting the tower to the point that they were disabled and couldn't fly on. That's the story. Here's the quiz question. How many dead birds do you think Dr. Kemper was able to document from that one tower? And just tell me when you think I've hit the number. That's it. 121,560 birds from one tower. Many other people, not for 38 years, did studies of other towers in other locations, and more recently, Travis Longcore in California did a summary of all the data and correction factors and all, and concluded that towers must kill 6.8 million birds per year in the United States and Canada. Okay, these communication systems were one of the harmful technologies that people invented during the 1900s. Here's another one, brought, of course, to my attention by the moose. Of course, roads and vehicles harm animals in many ways, but just the physical danger of millions of speeding cars going through animal habitat is a colossal intrusion. Richard Foreman and Lauren Alexander did an analysis of the number of animals likely to be affected and concluded that roads and vehicles likely kill about 1 million vertebrates, animals per day in North America, and that in the late 1900s, vehicles surpassed hunting as the leading direct human cause of vertebrate mortality on land. One more example. Who can recognize what this poster is? Now, this is from the Fatal Light Awareness Program in Toronto, which is campaigning for making glass windows less dangerous to birds. And this is a collection of dead birds from an area of office towers that they picked up in Toronto. It used to be that windows were little panels of glass like this in a framework, and the framework allowed birds to recognize that this is a solid surface. Now that we can produce these large plates of glass, windows become these huge reflective surfaces, reflecting vegetation by day, emitting light by night. Dr. Daniel Clem has been working on this issue for over 40 years. And he has concluded that windows and other reflective and transparent surfaces likely kill 1 billion birds each year in the United States and billions worldwide. All right, those examples, towers, highways, windows, are examples of technologies that cause unintended harm to animals. And there's lots more. Wind turbines, plowing of fields, devastating effects on burrowing rodents, oil spills, lost fishing gear, and so on. The good thing is that these are quite specific effects, and once we understand them, we can often find ways of mitigating the harm. For example, having the safety lights on towers flashing rather than steady burning cuts the number of dead birds in half. Dr. Clem has found there are window treatments that make windows reasonably safe. Managing residues of highway de-icing salt make roads relatively safe for moose in central Canada. The problem is it has been painfully slow to get action on these sort of issues. Why? Well, conservationists are generally not concerned if these don't involve endangered species or are numerically significant enough to affect population levels. And the animal protection movement tends not to regard these as their problems. Yet these are major animal welfare problems where we could make progress. I think one of the great challenges is to a moral awakening where we recognize that the technologies that we've introduced into the natural world are having harms that we can mitigate and need to do. All right, those are fairly direct harms. Even worse are cases where we harm animals by disturbing the basic processes and balances of nature, by things like habitat destruction, erosion, soil degradation, invasive species, spread of diseases, nutrient loading of waters, and probably worst of all, climate change. In these cases, once the initial harm has been done, there is remarkably little we can do to mitigate the effect on animals. The only solution really is to prevent these kind of harms from happening in the first place. Conservation and animal welfare have tended to develop as different social movements and different areas of science. Conservation focusing on wild animals, thinking about populations, ecological systems, and species, concerned about biodiversity, extinction, ecological integrity. Animal welfare traditionally has focused on captive and domesticated animals, thought about animals as individuals, and been concerned about things like animal health, quality of life, and emotional states. What we're seeing now, though, is that the harms of our huge human population and the intrusion of our technologies are causing both conservation problems and animal welfare problems on a huge scale. And I think one of the great challenges will be for the movements and the areas of science to work more closely together. So, challenges for the future, let me propose the following. First, a shift toward providing good lives for the animals in our care. Second, to recognize and improve the human factors in animal welfare. Third, to mitigate the harms that we cause through the intrusion of our technology in the natural world. And finally, to protect the life-sustaining processes and balances of nature that are fundamental to all life. Just to conclude, let me express again my deep thanks to all those who made the Animal Welfare Program possible and to the Faculty of Land and Food Systems for its continued support. My personal thanks to my wife and family, three generations of whom are present here tonight, whose unfailing support, even willingness to live beside mosquito-infested moose swamps, has allowed me to do what I've done. To the many, many former students, mentees, and colleagues, quite a number of whom are gathered here tonight, for 50 very engaging years of working with you. And my thanks to all of those gathered here for your interest in animal welfare and your support for what we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. As usual, you don't disappoint. And by the way, David, I did get a text from a musician who lives in BC sometimes. Michael Bublé would like to get some of those sonograms, and I think he's going to credit you. Okay? So this may be a very enjoyable night for you. Just before I introduce our moderator, I'd like to just remind the audience that we'll have a question and answer period, and you can use two forms. One is Slido, and Slido is done through your phone. And so if you go to the website, slido.com, and use our event code, #UBC AWP, to sign in, you can submit a question through that means. We also have the ability for those of you who are like myself, who are a little bit techno-challenged, we'll have students gather note cards. So if you have a question that you would like to put on a note card, please raise your hand, and we'll have a student who is in a gray t-shirt come and get that question, and we'll pass it on to David and Moira. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for tonight, a good friend and colleague, Professor Moira Quayle, is UBC's Vice Provost and Associate Vice President, Academic Affairs. We're going to have to get an acronym for that one. And among her many accomplishments, she was the founding director of UBC's School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and acted as Deputy Minister for the BC Ministry of Advanced Education. We are really lucky to have Moira here with us today because she has a deep connection with the faculty. She was my predecessor. In fact, she was two predecessors before I arrived here. She was the Dean of Land and Food for 8 years from 1997 to 2005. It's the same period that David was here. So thank you, Moira, for actually bringing David here. So without further ado, I'll ask Moira to come up and sit beside David, and we'll start the question and answer period. So over to you two.
As close as I can get. Speaking of technology, in case my hearing aids misbehave, I have to have my phone with me. So thank you, Ricky. Where are you? Where did you go?
Oh, I'm here. I'm hiding behind the podium.
Oh, there you are. Okay. Am I close enough to the mic? Yes? Okay, good. Well, it's a great honor for me to be here this evening to celebrate the UBC Animal Welfare Program. And thank you, David, for providing us with classic David Fraser. Can you stand it? I mean, what an amazing learning for all of us on a Friday night. Whew. So my interest in this conversation really has its beginnings in my incredibly positive learning experience as the Dean of Land and Food Systems. After all, what would a landscape architect know about animal welfare? Well, with David, Dan, and Nina, I had excellent teachers. I also want to give a shout out to Jim Thompson, to Nelson Din, and to the team at the UBC Dairy Farm in Agassiz. I'll never forget the challenge of moving the girls, in other words, the cows, from our farm at Oyster River to Agassiz. It's not really the thing that deans usually have to deal with, so it was a remarkable experience. And it's usually gratifying to hear David talk about the history of animal welfare science, the program itself, and the incredible growth of the reach to students. I really, all I can say is thank you to you and colleagues. I'd also like to thank all of you for being here this evening. So let's get started. I have a couple of questions just to get David warmed up, although I think he's already kind of warmed up. But don't forget to submit your questions via Slido or note cards, because we want to make sure that you have a lot of time to quiz David. Okay. So I have two questions that I want to ask before I open it up to the audience. One is a bit selfish in the sense that you've been in universities, not just UBC, but quite a long time at UBC. You've been in government. And I want to tap into your wisdom about what should UBC be doing in the future? You just articulated so clearly the challenges that we're facing in animal welfare. So what advice would you give to me and to Ricky? We have a new president coming in. We have a new provost coming in terms of how to position animal welfare at UBC to meet those challenges as best we can. Because I think Ricky and I would like to be able to take forward those ideas.
Okay. I think the big thing is pulling down barriers. In the areas that I see where we need improvement are, for example, how health and mental health of people influence animal welfare. That doesn't fit well in a university that's structured according to faculties based on disciplinary divisions. So there's one. A second challenge for the future is how our technologies and our harms to the natural systems of the world are creating problems at the individual animal level, that's animal welfare, and at the population and ecosystem level, that's conservation. So I think one of the great challenges would be to find ways of bridging different elements within the university. Any large institution develops certain structures that are meant to serve certain purposes, but inadvertently prevent other functions from happening. And so from my reading of the future, the traditional disciplinary boundaries that we see at a university are a serious impediment. Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. And I think that it's a real opportunity. Sometimes I think we need examples at the university for people to say, oh, wow, so maybe this is an opportunity, and I'm looking out at the animal welfare folks, to start putting pressure on that kind of integration and interdisciplinary thinking. And we're in the process of doing some academic planning right now, so it's a good time to push that. Right, Ricky? Yep. Okay, good. Thanks, David. My other question is, in a sense, more personal. Early in your talk, you referred to the crisis in animal welfare, and throughout and thinking about the challenges of climate change, of all of the wicked problems that are facing us right now. I'm interested in how, over your career, have you managed to be so close to these challenges, and kind of balancing hope and at the same time, the agony of looking at what we do to ourselves. How do you compartmentalize? Like, do you have a little box under the table where you put the things that you can't?
It's a bottle. It's a bottle. No, it's not a box. Okay. No. Thank you for the question. Serious question. I will withdraw my flippant answer. Okay. 2 or 3 things. One, the amount of change in the sense of improvement that I've seen over that long time period has been astonishing. When I started working with sows in stalls in the early 70s, I had no idea that the country I was working in would ban them on the basis of the kind of work that I was doing. It took 25 years, and so one could be very discouraged for the first 25 of those 25 years. Yeah? But the degree of change that I've seen has been very encouraging. Secondly, colleagues. I've had wonderful colleagues all through my career. Back in Edinburgh, I had lunch, my wife and I had lunch this summer with a colleague from Edinburgh, and the two of us and a third friend wrote the first chapter on farm animal welfare for a textbook in 1975, and we had lunch together this past year. Yeah? And the colleagues here in the Animal Welfare Program, the postdocs, the graduate students that we have, are really wonderful to work with. So having your own human work environment, it's a bit like the Norwegian farmers, you know. Job satisfaction from not feeling overwhelmed, from feeling supported, from having fun with people in your workplace. This is so important. I've seen university departments where people don't integrate. And universities are all over the map in this. In some cases, wonderful integration and collegiality. In other cases, it's like the feudal system, with each faculty member as the feudal lord with their own vassals, read graduate students, warring with each other. So creating that kind of collegial environment is critical to people having a positive attitude despite the challenges that they're facing. Yeah.
Thank you, David. Appreciate the, because I think I don't know about all of you, but it's something I feel like I face every day of how to manage some of the challenges. Okay, time over to you. I am looking at first question. What are some examples of successful integration of human health and animal health and welfare? How do we care for all?
Yeah, I guess what makes the biggest impression are the cases where it doesn't work. Yeah, so farmers have a high suicide rate compared to other occupations. Okay. I tend to get negative about this, but since this was a request for a positive example, the Union de Producteurs Agricoles, UPA in Quebec. It's like a farmers' union in Quebec. They were concerned about not just animal producers, but farmers generally, and the mental health problems and suicide incidents in that population. So they trained up, I think, 900 sentinel people who visited farms frequently. They could be vets, feed salespeople, equipment salespeople, and so on. And they got 1 day of training, 1 day. So this is not how to intervene. It is simply what to look for as a sign of problems so that an appropriate referral can be made. So here was a huge initiative by the farmers themselves to create a kind of a distant early warning system for health and mental health problems in their own population. I thought that was a really positive example. And the prairie area has another couple of grassroots organizations trying to help farmers with their mental health issues. Veterinarians also have some similar challenges. They're, putting down animals that they don't want to put down, etc. And there's now some supports, not nearly enough, but Alberta, I think in particular, is making a real effort at mental health in the veterinary profession. In animal shelters, traditionally, there's been a lot of research done on the stress caused to animal shelter workers when they have to put down animals. Now, the success rate in adopting animals from shelters in Canada is very good. In the US has improved considerably over the last few years. So putting down animals isn't such an issue. And Katie Kowaleski, who's here with us tonight, did a study of the BC SPCA and its animal sheltering and protection activities, and identified various stressors there that need to be addressed that are, the science got so focused on the stress caused by euthanasia that it tended to overlook the stress caused by other things. Such as an animal comes into the shelter with a behavioral problem, and they know that in order to get that animal adopted, they've got to work with the animal and solve the behavior problem, but they don't have the time or the training, or whatever it is, to accomplish that. And this is a source of stress for shelter workers. So I think an analysis of animal care organizations, following the kind of example that Katie set, of looking carefully at the organization and what is causing stress to the workers, I think that would be a very positive contribution for research to make.
Okay, there's an idea for prospective master's and PhD students, and maybe undergrads.
Well, I've got lots more.
This is a good question. What was the main catalyst that inspired you to go into animal welfare? And what's your best advice for someone looking to start a career in animal welfare?
Oh, dear. This sounds really lame, but I was offered a job. Yeah, and I honestly, at the beginning, I was going to study pigs, and I really liked pigs. And here was a full-time research position doing research on pigs. I thought, what a great opportunity. And as I got into it, I saw then the animal welfare issues that the pigs were confronting. And it was that process. It wasn't that I came at it with a messiah complex and I'm going to solve these problems. I didn't even think about the problems. I saw this as an opportunity to do some great science. And then became drawn into those issues. Advice. So that doesn't lend itself very well to advice, does it? And then of course moving to Moose. I mean, again, it wasn't that I chose to do that. It was what I had to do in order to come back to Canada at a time when there were no jobs in my area of expertise. And yet it was a really good experience. So maybe one thing would be opportunistic. Yeah. Take opportunities when they arise and make sure you do something with them. Yeah. And have one's eyes open for the issues that are present that need to be solved. I would say in almost all cases, I didn't go into something to solve that problem. I went in with a pretty blank mind and then became concerned because of the involvement that I had. But I'm not recommending that necessarily as a pattern, but that's what I did. Huh?
I don't know. I think it's pretty sound advice. It's just about being open-minded and considering the uniqueness factor. You know, okay, what would this be like?
Yeah.
So, okay. How do you think that wildlife conservation and animal welfare sciences will overlap in the future?
How to get that to happen is the issue, eh? And I think there are two things here. One is welfare of, I may not have made the distinction as clear as I should have in the talk. But in things like the road accidents, the communication towers, and the windows, there we can actually do the experiments and find the solutions. Daniel Clem is such an example in this. You know, he started studying birds colliding with windows and became passionate about that and found lots of good solutions. His great frustration is that he can't get the issues taken seriously. Now, UBC, to its great credit, has done so, and there's some great things happening at UBC with window treatments. I'm very impressed. But for example, Eastman Chemical has a film that can go over windows, and it has a pattern of ultraviolet reflection. So people don't see this pattern, but birds who are seeing in the UV range see this as if it is a grid work or a solid pattern. And it's magic at preventing bird collisions. He cannot get anybody to produce it and sell it. Okay, so in those sort of areas, I could see the humane movement taking a real lead in making people aware of this. So it becomes part of humane education, humane outreach, focusing on these problems with animals where there are solutions. The scientists need to be brought into these to improve the solutions, but it's working toward harm mitigation. In the bigger issues like climate change, the only thing we can do, we can't do much to mitigate the harms to animals that are going to come from climate change. And a little, but not much. And the only thing that can happen is to work together between conservationists and animal welfarists who have tended to be in silos, sometimes at war with each other. Yeah, we really need a combination of those two to try to prevent the long-range harms that are happening to both conservation goals and animal welfare goals. I don't know if I've provided any suggestions there other than just re-emphasizing my own feeling of importance.
Well, it sort of comes back to the crossing of disciplines, too.
Yeah, oh, for sure.
Yeah. Karen, is it time to get a last comment from David? Yes. So all those great questions, you'll just have to nab David at the end of the session. And so it would be, before we close, it's an opportunity for you to have one last shot at driving some of your great points home before we close. So just a few last pearls of wisdom from David Fraser.
I don't know about pearls. I think my pearl bag is pretty empty right now. But I would say what a pleasure it has been to work with the different people and organizations that I've worked with, and how critical that is to making progress on issues. if you don't feel part of a team, and then outside your own workplace, part of a network of people who get along at different career stages, if you get too, so I am very unhierarchical. We deliberately didn't create an animal welfare center with a director and that sort of structure because we wanted to have a very flat structure where people would contribute based on their interests and talents. And if a master's student has an ability to do a particular kind of social media outreach, they take the lead on that. If someone else has expertise in a particular area, they take the lead on that. And it becomes a very flat structure. I think that is not to say that there shouldn't, the program shouldn't become recognized as a center of the university, because that would have certain practical advantages, but to retain the idea of equality of contribution despite differences in where people fit into an artificial hierarchy. Yeah? I think that is critical to having people feel empowered, and it's the empowerment of people that is going to make a difference here.
Thank you, David. So important.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you, Maura. Like most great conversations, I wish we had infinite amounts of time so that we could conduct the discussion and carry on the discussion more. Just before I let you take a bit of a break, we have some gifts for you. They happen to come here magically. Maura, one for some closing remarks. Yeah, you get to leave. You get to sit in the comfy chairs now.
Should I be elegant or not?
Nah. Way to go, Moira. That's why we all love her. Okay. David, Moira, that was so inspiring. And, David, it gives us great hope for the Animal Welfare Program. So thank you very much. Before I make some closing remarks, I'd like to invite two of our animal welfare students to come up and talk about how you can be involved in this anniversary year. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Hello, my name is Bianca. I'm originally from Brazil, but the Animal Welfare Program has been my home ever since last year when I arrived as a visiting researcher, and I'm now a PhD student studying the social sustainability of the dairy industry. As Ricky mentioned, we have several activities planned this year to help celebrate our 25th anniversary. If you enjoyed the talk tonight, I'm sure you also enjoy our webinars. We have 6 webinars coming up. Our next one is Monday, November 7th. These webinars are moderated by a current student or professional, and we are interviewing alumni, some of who are here with us tonight. On November 7th, then we will be interviewing some veterinarians that have experience on animal welfare. You can register by going to our website. That is here. And also, if you want to know more about it, I'll be here tonight, so you can also come to me with any questions.
And hi, I am Wally Sahar. I am a PhD candidate with Animal Welfare Program, focusing on lameness in dairy cattle. I am originally from Afghanistan, but I have been working with the program since 2017. Importantly, we also have a crowdfunding campaign to help support the students who are experiencing financial hardship. Over the next 30 days or so, our hope is to exceed our goal of raising $5,000. If you would like more information, or if you would like to donate, You could visit the desk in the lobby, or you could also find us online on the link provided on the slides. Thank you.
Duncan, I won't need the clicker, right? No. Oh, great. Thank you. Well, what a wonderful evening to celebrate 50 years of animal welfare and 25 years of the Animal Welfare Program in our faculty. David, you know, I have to say that you're an inspiration to me. You were one of the first people I met when I think I interviewed here at UBC to be dean, and you've always been that gracious individual. You've always been that willing to help individual, so thank you. And thank you for being such an inspirational leader, because you gave the statistics from 20 students to, oh my God. So thank you for all that you've done. You know, I want to thank you, the audience, for coming out. You know, this event wouldn't happen without David, Moira, but more importantly, you. And so thank you for coming out and supporting our animal welfare program. You know, David, I have to say that I was at this event that we celebrated the Killam awardees. And Nina, I think you'll remember when Deborah Buzzard, our pro tem president, advice that was given to her by her father was, if you see an open door, go through it. And I think that's exactly what you've done. So congratulations on going through many doors, because your life has not been linear by any stretch. I think it's more by accident than by design. So at this point, I'm going to conclude the evening, but I understand, Karen, that some of the alumni would like to have a picture with David. So David, and I would ask the animal welfare faculty members to come up, and we'll take a photograph. I guess Duncan, Sahil, are you taking that photograph? Oh, Megan, sorry, Megan. So I guess I'll invite everyone who would like to have a picture with David and the animal welfare faculty to come up front. But thank you so much again. Safe drive home. And by the way, the reason I'm wearing shorts is because if it rains, the bottom of my pants aren't going to get wet. So let that be some advice. So thanks very much, everyone.